In the autumn of 1944, America's newest air weapon, the powerful Super Fortress, was used with great effect in raids over Japan. On these missions, the B-29s were exposed to attack by Japanese fighters. Without fighter cover, the huge bombers were vulnerable to these persistent attacks by the Japanese fighters. Just halfway between the B-29 bases in the Marianas and the target, Japan, the island called Iwo Jima was in an ideal position for use by the U.S. as a base from which to launch fighters to accompany the B-29s on their missions. In late 1944, the U.S. High Command decided that Iwo Jima must be seized, and preparations were made for the assault against that island fortress. Beginning in October, American B-24s made regular pre-invasion bomb runs to Iwo. The U.S. 7th Air Force bombed Iwo Jima almost daily for 72 days in late 1944 and early 45. At U.S. bases in the Pacific, Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions prepared for the assault. The invasion troops were accompanied on the trip to the objective by great quantities of materiel, the machines of 20th century war. With the assault forces aboard ship, the task force moved northward toward the island target in mid-February. In waters so close to the enemy's homeland, it was no longer possible to capitalize on the element of surprise. The Marines who were to make the assault were briefed on the enemy and his defenses. No punches were pulled. The men were told that Iwo was the closest thing to a fortress in the Pacific Ocean. At least they knew what to expect. There was nothing further the commanders could do to change the complexion of the head-on assault. Before the men stormed ashore to seize the island fortress, a last blessing was given by the troop chaplains. The final divine services on shipboard were attended by many of the assault Marines, who welcomed the opportunity to rededicate their efforts to God. The warships opened up on the island at 6:40 on D-Day morning. An interested observer aboard the flagship was Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who said at that time, "This target, like Tarawa, leaves very little except to take it by force of arms, character, and courage. Mount Suribachi, which dominated the island, was a prime target for Navy gunners. The preliminaries to the actual landing went off smoothly. H hour had been set at 9 a.m., and everyone was intent on making it on schedule. Trained to razor sharpness, the Marines took to the boats early on D-Day morning. Some 10,000 men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions left the transports to make the initial assault. On that faintly chilly February morning, the sea was calm. Many of the Marines were veterans of other campaigns. Some had never been in combat before. Men like Private First Class Harold Wergers.
I tried to figure out what time it was in St. Louis, my hometown. This operation had all the earmarks of being a real fight. At a time like this, you felt all keyed up inside, the blood coursing through your veins so fast your fingertips tingled. You wanted to get ashore quick and start getting some of those guys who were firing at our ships and scoring a hit every now and then. It seemed like hours getting to the beach. It began to get rougher, but my outfit, the 1st Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment, made it okay. We landed on schedule. It seemed weird, knowing how many Japs there were, getting set to let you have it, but not being able to see a one of them. Pretty soon you knew for sure they were there. On the beach it got really rugged. I never expected it to be this rough. Some companies were cut down to half strength that first morning, half their men knocked out. More men were landed, including the rest of my regiment, the 28th Marines. We had to hang on to that beachhead, whatever happened. What made it even tougher was the slow going in that volcanic sand. It slowed us down, and it slowed the equipment down. The fight for the beachhead at Iwo was a real nightmare. I don't think any of us will ever forget it. That first morning, about a third of the men in our company got hit. But we kept on fighting for that toehold. Iwo didn't get any more comfortable at any time during those first few days. The corpsmen had their hands full. They were busier than any of us. A lot of our equipment got bogged down in the loose sand and was knocked out by the enemy. And an awful lot of Marines got it on the beach at Iwo.
On the evening of D+2, the U.S. ships offshore were attacked in a heavy air raid. The gunners scored hits on some of the Japanese suicide planes. In the furious 3-hour-long battle, the U.S. lost one carrier and had another damaged. 15 of the kamikazes were knocked down. From Mount Suribachi, the Japanese poured their fire on the landing beaches below. No spot on the U.S. beachhead was protected from enemy fire as long as the Japanese held Suribachi. The job of bringing additional troops ashore under that heavy pounding was a delicate operation. And just as important as the added manpower was the materiel, which was so necessary in the drive to reduce the enemy's fortress. It became obvious on the first day that Suribachi would have to be taken as quickly as possible. Elements of the 28th Marine Regiment were assigned the job of seizing Suribachi, including Private First Class Werger's unit.
We gave the Hot Rock everything we had.
Fire!
After that opening, you'd have thought we could have walked right up the side of the mountain. We gained a little ground, but the enemy kept letting us have it. We picked up a few yards here and there, but we had a long way to go. So many men got hit, there weren't enough Navy corpsmen to go around, and they took heavy casualties too. We kept pushing ahead, making every clip count. But it was tough going. They kept pouring it down on top of us. that seemed like weeks just fighting for the land around the base of the rock. Finally, on what they tell me was the fourth day on Iwo, we began to pick our way up the slope. On the way up, we ran into some Japs, but they didn't give us too much trouble. This was no place for anybody with a weak stomach.
The Marines of the 28th Regiment spent 4 days in getting to the crest of the 556-foot-high mountain. Once again, the Marine spirit had been a prime factor in the capture of this difficult objective against great odds. On February 23, 1945, the Marines raised the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi as a signal to the troops below that the mountain was won. That flag was seen around the world. During those first 5 days on Iwo, the Marine Corps suffered 6,845 casualties. Of that number, 5,284 were wounded, and a great many of those men were saved. Most of the wounded were surgical cases. Some of the casualties were suffering badly from shock. The men who took Suribachi were able to appreciate why it had been so tough. The enemy had been solidly entrenched. The Japanese on Iwo's mountain had fought one of the most determined defenses of the war. But it had proved fruitless. Hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers were strewn about the slopes of Mount Suribachi after the battle. The situation was reversed. The U.S. forces now dominated the southern end of the island. The original U.S. beachhead was littered with wrecked equipment. But though a considerable amount of materiel had been rendered useless to the U.S. fighting men on Iwo, other machines and weapons in impressive quantities had been successfully brought ashore and put to use against the enemy. Ground Forces Commander Marine General Holland Smith was anxious to have the area cleared of enemy mines and rendered safe for the landing of additional reinforcements and supplies for use in the drive north on the island. 3rd Marine Division combat troops, which had been held in reserve, landed on Iwo with 3rd Marine Division headquarters and attached units. The 2 regimental combat teams of the 3rd Marine Division now on the island were to be used in the center of the drive north. The reinforcements, too, were surprised by the difficult footing. In the loose volcanic sand, vehicles designed for use on any terrain bogged down hopelessly. On Iwo, metal mats were essential for the movement of many vehicles inland from the beaches. The invading Marines had not expected to have so much trouble with Iwo's soil, but they overcame the problem in short order nevertheless. Before the concerted attack against the enemy for the northern section of the island, some Marines attended religious services only a short distance from enemy positions to the north. One of the Marines' most pressing supply problems was the lack of water on the island. After the southern end of the island had been secured, the Marines installed distillation units, which converted the seawater and signaled the end of limited water rationing, which had prevailed since the morning of D-Day. With Suribachi and the southern end of Iwo won, the U.S. forces girded themselves for the conquest of the northern section of the island. The 3 Marine divisions which would fight that campaign were well prepared. Some of the men who had battled the enemy on Mount Suribachi took a few moments off to clean up before going back into action. U.S. forces controlled the southern end of the island, but still had to seize the broader northern section. General Holland Smith and his staff were faced with the problem of taking that territory from a well-disciplined enemy force of considerable size. The Marines' campaign against the enemy on the northern part of the island, which had been begun on the 2nd day, picked up momentum after Suribachi had been taken, and all the Marine units on the island could be concentrated on the final sweep to the north. That drive called for the perfect coordination of the troops of the three Marine divisions, working smoothly together under difficult conditions. The success of the Marine drive to the northern tip of Iwo depended in large measure on the performance in action of U.S. tanks. Some 150 Shermans were employed on Iwo to pace the advance of Marine ground forces in the drive north. This phase of the battle for Iwo was much tougher than the fight for Suribachi. For a solid week, 4th Division Marines fought for a series of ridges surrounding Hill 382, less formally known as the Meat Grinder. And for a week, they were driven back. Then the drive northward on the right flank continued. Once its rockets were fired, the vulnerable rocket launchers quickly left the area. Casualties grew heavier as the Marines pushed the frantic enemy into a smaller and smaller corner of the island. In some areas, the territory had to be taken ridge by ridge. The drive for the capture of the 3rd Airfield on Iwo was executed by 3rd Division Marines, who led the advance up the island at the point of the wedge-shaped offensive. In crashing through the enemy's strong defensive line, the men of the 3rd Division took quite a beating. The men of the 2 regimental combat teams of the 3rd Marine Division broke the back of the enemy's main stand in the north of Iwo. The enemy force on the island was rapidly being whittled down. But even though the main defense belt had been penetrated, the wary Marines still had some territory to seize from the stubbornly resisting enemy. The U.S. force had suffered the loss of much equipment and thousands of fighting men. But Iwo Jima, only 750 miles from Tokyo, was almost entirely in American possession. No longer would enemy planes take off from Iwo's strips on missions against U.S. forces in the heart of Japan's inner defense zone. The campaign on Iwo Jima had several noteworthy aspects from a medical standpoint. One was the employment of whole blood and plasma on a scale never before attempted, with gratifying results. It had been estimated that casualties would total 31% of the entire force. Actually, casualties amounted to almost 33% of U.S. manpower participating in the operation on the island. The Navy operated an evacuation hospital, which began functioning on the island on the 9th day of the battle. All the necessary facilities were available to Navy doctors and corpsmen, working only a mile or two from the front. With the opening of several evacuation hospitals on Iwo, it was possible for all initial surgery to be performed on the island itself. The most difficult cases were operated on as quickly as possible, often less than an hour after the wound had been sustained, and the lives of thousands of fighting men were saved. Starting on the 13th day of the battle for Iwo, many of the casualties were evacuated by air. At certain times, this method provided the only means of evacuation from the island, because of unfavorable sea conditions or lack of facilities afloat. During the last 3 weeks of the battle on Iwo, about 100 casualties a day were put aboard planes and flown off the island. By March 16th, the Marines had won all of Iwo, except for a small area near the northern tip of the island. Japanese who had been taken prisoner were used to appeal to their brothers in arms to surrender. But in most cases, the appeals were not as successful as other methods of persuasion. Some prisoners were taken on Iwo, but they represented only a handful of the 22,000 troops who had fought the carefully executed defense of the island. Only 217 prisoners were taken, 159 of them Japanese. As on other Pacific battlegrounds, the soldiers who surrendered spoke readily about the location of their positions. The Marines were eager to clean out the last enemy pocket. The Marines who were engaged in seizing the last enemy area had been fighting on Iwo for almost 4 weeks. It was slow, exacting work. Finally, by March 25th, the men completed the job. In the battle for the last pocket, some of the enemy soldiers had held out until the very end. In Iwo Jima, the enemy lost one of its most vital defensive bastions. After 36 days of the most bitter fighting American forces had ever known, the U.S. had all of Iwo. For that 8-square-mile heap of volcanic ash jutting out of the Pacific, the U.S. had paid an exorbitant price. The lives of 5,563 Marines and 982 sailors. In addition to the dead, the casualty figure showed some 19,000 men wounded in the battle for Iwo Jima. Tons of shell cases gave evidence of the important role played by artillery in the 5-week-long campaign. U.S. forces in the Pacific had decided that Iwo must be taken at any cost, and they had thrown themselves into the struggle with all the power available. With the job successfully accomplished, the top priority assignment was the extension of one of the airfields so that it could accommodate America's newest heavy bombers. Marine engineering units and Navy construction battalions accomplished their job in miraculously short order. The field's great value to the U.S. lay in its use as an emergency base for crippled B-29s, unable to return all the way to their Marianas bases. More than 850 damaged B-29s landed safely at Iwo during the following 3 months. In addition, Iwo strips provided a perfect base for U.S. fighter planes, now capable of making it to Japan and return. With fighter cover, the raids on Japan were less hazardous. After the victory at Iwo, Okinawa was the next major enemy island on the U.S. schedule. An assault force of soldiers and Marines made the invasion on Easter Sunday, 1945. In early 1945, U.S. forces focused their attention on an imposing objective, Okinawa. Lying only 350 miles from Japan proper, Okinawa would make the perfect base from which to launch the proposed invasion of Japan itself. But though the Japanese were losing more and more outlying territory, on the home islands, the Japanese military forces would be able to muster sufficient manpower to fight a strong defensive battle. In early 1945, President Roosevelt returned from Yalta and reported on the most significant developments of that important conference with Great Britain and Russia.
We haven't won the wars yet, with an S on wars. It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin. in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan. On the contrary, we must be prepared for a long and costly struggle in the Pacific. But the unconditional surrender of Japan is as essential as the defeat of Germany.
In the far Pacific, 3 divisions of U.S. Marines were engaged in wiping out the enemy on a small strategic volcanic island named Iwo Jima. Japan still managed to supply its troops on the Asiatic mainland, where the Emperor's forces were firmly entrenched. If Okinawa were taken by the U.S., Japan's supply line to those forces would be effectively severed. In March 1945, at Ulithi in the Caroline Group, the U.S. Navy amassed an amphibious force of unprecedented proportions. That force moved north, directed by one of the Navy's top amphibious fleet commanders, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Carrier planes of Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet hit the home islands of Japan and then softened up the target island of Okinawa. Meanwhile, the warships of the mighty 5th Fleet moved toward the objective. And on March 25th, enemy positions on the island came under attack by a score of U.S. warships, which fired salvo after salvo. On March 26th, 77th Division GIs assaulted the Kurama Islands, a valuable subsidiary base of operations. And on April 1st, the key island of Okinawa was invaded. The assault was made by the U.S. 10th Army, which was composed of GIs of the Army's 24th Corps and Marines of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. 16,000 men were in the first wave to land on Japan's doorstep on the western coast of Okinawa. It seemed hard to believe, but there was no opposition. Most of the veterans in the invasion force, old campaigners who had fought at Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte, suspected that this was an April Fool's Day trick on the enemy's part. The soldiers and Marines pushed across the island and were followed by thousands more. The men advanced quickly across the neck of the island toward the east coast against very light resistance. Only scattered enemy troops fired on the invaders. U.S. troops gained ground easily. The American plan was to bisect the island and thus divide the enemy's forces. During those first few days on Okinawa, U.S. soldiers and Marines encountered only feeble resistance. It was difficult for the men to understand. Only 350 miles from Japan, and no heavy opposition by the enemy. In the advance across the island's neck, the American fighting men did meet some enemy patrol, but no opposition strong enough to impede the 10th Army's progress. The island was cut in two by April 4th, when U.S. troops reached the east coast. During the next 3 days, a considerable amount of territory was seized in the northern section. The beachhead was firmly established, and supplies were being brought ashore in impressive quantities. To keep the men of the 10th Army fed and equipped put a heavy burden on the Navy, which employed more than 1,000 ships of all types during the Okinawa campaign. At sea, the men of the vast fleet standing off the island were growing concerned about the enemy's heavy air attacks. Off Okinawa, the Japanese made maximum use of their frenzied kamikaze attack plan. The Navy took heavy losses as further waves of suicide planes dove into U.S. ships. The waters off Okinawa became as violent a battleground as the island itself. At airfields on Kyushu, southernmost island of Japan proper, more and more hastily trained pilots were inducted into kamikaze service. No honor was considered greater than the privilege of making a suicide dive against an American ship. Fortunately, not all the kamikaze missions were successful. To the men in the fleet, the skies seemed always full of kamikazes. In the waters between Okinawa and the Japanese home islands, some U.S. ships were hit in enemy bombing attacks. On the U.S. carrier Franklin, casualties were very heavy. In the struggle to save the ship, Chaplain Joseph O'Callaghan of Cambridge, Massachusetts, played a memorable part and was subsequently awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
It appeared that most of the crew were dead, and of the living, almost everyone was wounded. The few survivors of Franklin will never forget that cold March morning in the far Pacific. The flight deck littered with dead and dying. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
More than 250 U.S. ships of all types were sunk or damaged by the enemy's air attacks in the Okinawa operation. On April 12, 1945, U.S. fighting forces lost their commander-in-chief. While a sorrowing nation mourned his passing, a new chief executive took the oath of office. President Harry Truman was well aware of his heavy responsibilities as America's war leader. In Washington, the nation's grief was mirrored in the faces of the crowds which lined the route of the procession. Halfway around the world on Okinawa, many of the combat troops paused to attend a memorial service not far from the front. President Roosevelt's death at this critical point was a real blow to the servicemen, who had felt a close bond with their late commander-in-chief. Some officers worried about a drop in morale, but most of the men resolved to fight with even greater determination to help achieve the final victory as quickly as possible. On Okinawa, the battle was far from won. Cleaning out the long section of the island north of the beachhead was the job of the 6th Marine Division. They moved quickly against an enemy force which was fighting from ideal natural defensive positions. On Motobu Peninsula, the Marines ran into sudden stiff resistance near Mount Yaitaki. The enemy pocket was wiped out during a 3-day fight by the veterans of Eniwetok and Guam. The men moved forward quickly and cleaned out the peninsula where most of the enemy's northern force on Okinawa was concentrated. In the 13-day campaign on Motobu, 2,014 enemy soldiers met death. The Marines mopped up the rugged northern area of Okinawa against sporadic resistance. All but a handful of the thousands of Japanese were killed by the 6th Marine Division in taking the northern section of the island. On April 20th, the Marines of the 6th Division secured the northern section of Okinawa. In a quick amphibious operation, 77th Division GI seized Iwo Jima, where the foot soldier's great friend and supporter Ernie Pyle met his death. On southern Okinawa, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, 10th Army commander, ran up against the enemy's main line of defense. Artillery, supported by tanks, went to work on the enemy's defensive line. In early May, the Army's 24th Corps, stalled on the southern front, was reinforced by the Marines of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. The battle-wise enemy commander, General Ushijima, had chosen to make his stand along a line which stretched across the island from Naha to Yonabaru. On May 8th, the 6th Division Marines prepared to attack south along the west coast in the drive to take Naha and pierce the enemy's line. To cut that western anchor of the enemy's defense, the Marines concentrated all their power in the new offensive. The battle remained a stalemate, partly attributable to the heavy rains which turned the countryside into a morass of mud. Most of the heavy equipment became hopelessly bogged down in the mire. The Army 24th Corps, which was trying to mount a crushing offensive against the bulk of the enemy's Okinawa force, found its assignment especially difficult with the beginning of Okinawa's celebrated plum rains, which set in on a daily basis late in May and greatly complicated the operation. The struggle to reduce the enemy's positions in the Naha area continued for several weeks. Dislodging the enemy from his carefully prepared defenses was a demanding assignment and a costly one. The Marines' answer to the enemy's strong, well-integrated defenses was the tank infantry team. In the U.S. attack, some tanks were lost, and the Marines suffered a sizable number of casualties before they were able to move into the capital city. After a bitter campaign, the Marines completed the capture of Naha by May 28th. The city was almost a total wreck. For their successful seizure of this hub of the enemy's defense on Okinawa, 2 regiments of the 6th Marine Division, the 22nd and 29th, were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. The city had felt the full weight of U.S. firepower. The fall of the capital city signaled the beginning of the last major phase of the battle for Okinawa. With Naha in American possession, the offensive picked up speed all along the line. 3 Army and 2 Marine divisions pressed the attack with renewed spirit from one coast of Okinawa to the other, from the Pacific Ocean to the East China Sea. Marines of the 1st Division pierced the enemy's salient at Shuri in the island's rugged interior. The U.S. forces suffered a considerable number of casualties in beating down the enemy's grim defense of southern Okinawa. The news from the European theater gave the men a lift. But on Okinawa, there was still a war to be fought. The seizure of the Yonabaru area by soldiers of the 24th Corps marked the collapse of the enemy's defense line on Okinawa's east coast. Across the island, 6th Division Marines encountered stiff resistance on Oroku Peninsula. During the 10-day fight for Oroku Peninsula, the enemy suffered some 5,000 casualties. The Marines worked hard to annihilate the enemy's last-ditch defense. With resistance eliminated on Oroku Peninsula, the 6th Marine Division controlled the entire Naha area. For this action, the 4th Marine Regiment was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. In the capture of Oroku Peninsula, the U.S. forces gained control of Naha Airfield, complete with dummy planes, which the enemy used to suggest a strong air base. With the airfield no longer in enemy hands, U.S. forces could finally make use of the port of Naha. By mid-June, U.S. troops had completely broken the enemy's main line of defense on Okinawa. On June 17th, U.S. forces were only a few miles from the southern tip of the island. Once the main defense of Okinawa had been fought, to no avail, the Japanese soldiers began to give themselves up more readily. The combat efficiency of the remaining Japanese units was cut down by the heavy casualties the defenders of Okinawa were sustaining. The advancing American troops also brought a number of civilians to safety. Some of the Okinawans had holed out in any place of refuge available. Some had stayed hidden for weeks. Many had had no food or water for some time. The Okinawans had been led to expect far different treatment than they actually received at the hands of the American troops. As the 83-day battle for Okinawa neared its end, thousands of inhabitants of that hilly island gave themselves up. For the Okinawans, the war was at an end. The natives now saw Japanese claims of victory after victory in their true light. On Okinawa, some 196,000 of the island's population were herded into internment camp areas to keep them out of the path of the final U.S. offensive. Even under these hectic conditions, an attempt was made to keep members of a family from being separated. The prisoner of war camps were crowded with the largest concentration of Japanese troops ever taken prisoner in any campaign during World War II in the Pacific. In the closing days of the battle, the enemy soldiers had finally refused to obey their officers, had surrendered themselves to their conquerors. The code of Bushido, death before surrender, was no longer followed without question by Japanese fighting men. At the Southern Front, 10th Army Commander General Buckner had final victory in his grasp when his life was cut short by an enemy shell. Meanwhile, the drive for the last piece of enemy territory on Okinawa was underway. A new weapon, the recoilless rifle, was used for the first time in combat during the campaign's final days. On June 22nd, 1945, the last enemy unit was overwhelmed. American fighting men controlled Okinawa to the extreme southern tip. The enemy had lost an invaluable base only 350 miles from Japan proper. And the United States had gained still another island, again after paying a heavy price. General Buckner was the only field army commander to lose his life by enemy action in the Asiatic Pacific Theater during World War II. And thousands of men in his command also gave their lives on Okinawa. The battle for this strategically important island near Japan proved a most costly one for both warring nations. The loss of the machines and weapons of war was also seriously felt by both sides. The heavy destruction of aircraft was another crippling blow, particularly to the Japanese. Top U.S. commanders like Admiral Nimitz remained firm in their determination to carry the fight to Japan itself.
American forces fighting in the Pacific have brought the war to the home islands of Japan. We have sunk the larger part of the Japanese fleet, and in the next few months, we will exploit every opportunity to finish that particular job. Army and Navy aircraft bombed large areas of Japan's principal cities into rubble. And unless Japan surrenders soon, we intend to complete that destruction.
The airplane, as a military weapon, was employed to a limited extent in World War I. In the battle for Western Europe, Allied pilots like Captain Eddie Rickenbacker prepared to engage Germany's top aviators in the skies over the battlefield. But in that war, the airplane did not contribute much in the achieving of the ultimate victory. 25 years later, the airplane had come of age. In World War II, the airplane assumed a major role in the strategy designed to effect complete victory in the first truly global war. The final knockout punch in the war against Japan was delivered from the air. For almost 4 years of war in the far-flung Pacific, this was the objective of every soldier, sailor, marine, and airman serving in the Asiatic Pacific Theater of Operations. The first attack on Japan was launched early in the war. In April 1942, the U.S. carrier Hornet moved deep into enemy waters to a position only 600 miles from the Japanese coast. The Hornet's daring raid caught the enemy off guard. Colonel Jimmy Doolittle had trained his men diligently in the technique of taking off in a bomber on a short runway. But this was the first real test. The attention of every man above decks was focused on that first takeoff. 16 B-25s took off successfully from the Hornet's deck and headed for Japan. Their mission, the bombing of Tokyo and 3 other Japanese cities, had a tonic effect on America's sagging morale. The airmen who had crash-landed successfully in China or off the China coast were decorated by Madame Zheng for their courageous flight. 2 years later, the first land base from which raids could be made on the enemy's homeland was put into operation. From China, America's newest heavy bomber, the B-29, could fly to Japan and back in one hop. Other bases, capable of accommodating the superfortresses, were put into operation in India. Thus, the whole of eastern and southern Asia, from Tokyo to Rangoon, was within range of the new U.S. air weapon. In mid-1944, the air attacks on the Japanese homeland were not undertaken for the psychological effect alone. From this point on, the air war was designed to blast Japan into total defeat. From Mariana's bases, B-29s would soon be able to attack Japan in some numbers, and the air war on the enemy's home islands could be greatly accelerated. But the building of those bases was a job of far greater proportions than the customary airstrips hurriedly built on newly won islands. On terrain so rugged that the enemy considered the building of a large air base impossible, U.S. engineers went to work on the construction of 3 huge airfields, which were to have a direct bearing on the time needed for achieving the final victory. By November, the first of the massive runways was almost ready to be put into operation. The engineers worked around the clock, putting the finishing touches on the field. In October 1944, the first B-29s touched down at their new home bases in the Marianas. The 6,000-mile flight from California had taken them just 25 hours. For the all-important missions which lay ahead, the crews had trained in Kansas, Colorado, and in the Caribbean. Now they were anxious to put that training to good use.
Well, the first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking.
The 21st Bomber Command was ready to go into business. On the morning of November 24th, 1944, the giant planes were readied for their first bombing mission over Japan. 245 tons of bombs in 500-pound packages were loaded into the super forts. This was to be the first mass strike against the heart of Japan. Several hours and 1,500 miles later, the B-29s were over the enemy's homeland. Over Tokyo, the bombardiers went to work. At 30,000 feet, the superforts were reasonably safe from enemy anti-aircraft fire, but not entirely. Over the target area, the planes were attacked by Japanese fighters. Some of the enemy's fighters were knocked out of the sky by the superfort's crews, but more kept pouring in on the big bomber. Mission accomplished, the B-29s headed quickly for their Marianas bases, 1,500 miles away. During those first flights back from the target, the crews of some of the crippled superforts ended up in the chilly waters of the North Pacific. Starting on November 27th, the enemy struck back with a vengeance, attacking the U.S. base on Flatbow. The raiders did a fair amount of damage. Some B-29s were total casualties. Many of the enemy raids on U.S. bases in the Marianas were made at night. Meanwhile, on the decks of U.S. carriers in northern Pacific waters, additional raids on the enemy's homeland were prepared by the Navy. The carrier-based pilots of the Navy's fast striking force were assigned targets in the heart of the enemy's industrial areas.
I want to assign specific targets on that factory area. Committee, bring your second troop a little farther east, come down, putting your division on these two large assembly plants, and Sam, knock these big buildings up. Now you have specific targets to hit, and I want you to all get hit.
Already ready for mail plot.
A few hundred miles off Japan, the strike was launched. In no time at all, the planes were over the first of their targets and peeling off for the dive. Other planes attacked enemy airfields. Before heading back, some of the planes went to work on enemy harbor installations and shipping. Inevitably, not all the carrier planes escaped unharmed. In many cases, the pilots managed to bail out successfully. In his rubber boat, the downed pilot had a good chance of survival. Rainwater replenished the limited supply of water each flyer carried. Thus, if the weather were reasonably good, the pilot had a better than even chance of being spotted. In World War II in the Pacific, U.S. submarines performed a valuable supplementary function, spotting and picking up airmen and sailors whose vessels had been destroyed by the enemy. Some 500 U.S. servicemen were rescued at sea by U.S. subs in the Pacific during the war against Japan. With the seizure of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, U.S. fighter planes had a base from which they could easily fly to Japan and return. At the Marianas B-29 bases, preparations were made for heavier attacks against the enemy's home islands, now that the big bombers would have fighter cover over the target area. The operation of the bases from which the raids against Japan were launched became a larger and more complex problem during the early months of 1945. The mapping out of routes to specific targets in Japan for some 1,000 B-29s was only one of the exacting jobs which added to the traffic problem for the operations center of the 21st Bomber Command. This office was a highly geared nerve center in the preparation of the raids over Japan. Shortly before takeoff time, the crews had their targets spotted for them on the radar scope.
Here's how the scope should look when you've located the target and have gain and tilt properly adjusted. Here's your target today. The arsenal is located to the left side of the town. However, since the 3 degrees beam width tends to spread a town out along an axis perpendicular to the airplane, do not aim at the edge of the town, but a little inside the left edge. You can see then that it's important that you hit your initial point on the money and make an accurate turn to the target heading. Otherwise, you may not be able to find your target.
Final preparations for the flight were made in an atmosphere which was always charged with excitement. For the crew members, no mission over the heart of the enemy's homeland ever became routine. The start of another flight on the most dangerous run in the Pacific Theater was always a dramatic moment. 300 superforts were ready for the takeoff. The giant planes hurtled down the runway right on schedule. Some 1,500 miles from this island base lay the heart of Japan, the objective of the 300 B-29s in this early April raid. Over Iwo Jima, halfway to the target, the superforts were joined by Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command, based on that island, recently seized by U.S. Marines. The P-51s embarked eagerly on their first mission to Japan. With fighter support, the big bombers were much better able to cope with enemy attacks in the skies over Japan. But the Japanese fighters gave battle nevertheless. The Mustangs went right to work. The enemy planes kept boring in on the Mustangs in spite of their loss. 21 Japanese fighters were shot down in this raid. Sometimes a U.S. pilot got a close look at his recent adversary. The B-29s assigned to hit the Tokyo area usually checked their position by sighting in on Mount Fuji before moving in on the target.
Radar operator, this is Bombardier. Over.
Go ahead, Bombardier.
The site's set up. We're ready to bomb.
Roger, out. Pilot, direct 8 degrees right.
Roger.
Bombardier, open bomb bay doors after turn.
Roger.
Get ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 60 degrees. Mark.
Bombs away.
This was the moment when the long flight paid off. The superforts dropped their bombs right on the target. Beginning in March, B-29s from the Marianas began dropping incendiaries on Japan at night. But these night attacks were discontinued, since the results were not particularly impressive from the standpoint of damage done to military targets. The superforts intensified their daylight attacks on industrial and military objectives in Japan during the early spring months of 1945. Tokyo came in for the largest share of attention from the B-29s of the 21st Bomber Command of the 20th Air Force. These mass attacks had a shattering effect on Japan's capital city. The city was bombed into a great mass of rubble. Most of Tokyo's fragile buildings had simply disappeared under the heavy pounding from the skies. A few, like the Diet Building, where the legislature met, had survived. Tokyo's inhabitants were thoroughly broken in spirit. In March, the B-29s had an emergency base on Iwo Jima, located midway between Japan and the Marianas Fields. Crippled superforts, unable to make it all the way back to their home bases after being hit over Japan, came into Iwo. Some 2,000 B-29s landed at Iwo, some not too successfully. Thousands of airmen who would otherwise have perished were saved at Iwo. The U.S. Third Fleet also closed in on Japan to administer a softening up of the home island in preparation for invasions by U.S. amphibious forces. Admiral Bull Halsey, the Third Fleet's commander, moved boldly into the waters off the Japanese coast. On July 17, 1945, U.S. and British warships fired some 2,000 tons of shells into the coastal area northeast of Tokyo. The fleet units encountered no opposition during this daring attack on the enemy's homeland. Japan was ripe for invasion. In the United States, before the war, Albert Einstein did extensive research in the field of nuclear fission. Dr. Einstein's findings were developed still further at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory by Dr. Enrico Fermi and his associates, who worked out the process for making plutonium and produced the first atomic pile. In July 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer and his fellow scientists, who had worked on the development of the new secret weapon, prepared themselves for the critical first test. The area was heavily guarded. Doctors Vannevar Bush and James Bryant Conant were among the few spectators. The first atomic bomb explosion was an impressive success. In the Marianas, at 20th Air Force Headquarters, General Curtis LeMay and his staff worked at feverish speed on the planning for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. If the atom bomb could be safely transported by air to a point over Japan, its use could well have such a devastating effect that the war might be materially shortened. The target was finally selected. The Japanese city of Hiroshima had escaped damage in U.S. bombing raids on the home islands. On that sunny August morning, Hiroshima had no premonition of its fate. On Tinian Island in the Marianas, a B-29 named the Enola Gay prepared to make the first atomic bomb run. Over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the course of world history took a new turn. The new weapon blasted the enemy completely out of the war. Japan no longer had the will to fight. Hiroshima lay in ruins. Within a few seconds, the sizable city had been demolished by the atomic blast. On August 19th, 4 days after the enemy surrendered, a Japanese plane arrived at Iwo Jima, the tiny island off Okinawa. This was the first meeting between American commanders and Japanese military men since the surrender. The Japanese negotiators stopped off at Iwo Jima to be taken by U.S. transportation to Manila to discuss the terms of the surrender. In late August, preparations were made for the formal surrender ceremony. An excited Japanese harbor pilot was transferred to the Missouri from a ship alongside. On the Missouri, U.S. naval officers carefully studied the charts of Tokyo Bay, which the Japanese pilot had brought aboard. Every precaution was taken to be sure that the Big Mo would be guided safely through the channels to its berth in Tokyo Bay. Meanwhile, at Yokosuka Naval Base, U.S. fighting men went ashore to occupy the conquered country. For 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, the United States concentrated its energies on the conduct of a demanding global war. The American people turned their full attention to the job of winning that war. In the Pacific Asiatic Theater, U.S. fighting men pushed the enemy back to the shores of Japan itself by the summer of 1945. In early August, the U.S. brought the enemy finally to the point of surrender after some 44 months of the most grueling warfare. A number of Japan's largest cities lay in ruins. The course of aggression on which the Japanese nation had embarked some 14 years earlier had led to a tragic end. On a day most Americans will never forget, August 15th, 1945, the Third Fleet was in waters near Japan. Its commander, Admiral Bull Halsey, was impatiently waiting for the news which all the world was anxious to hear.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Finally, the all-important message came through by wireless. The enemy had surrendered. The war was over. Every man in the fleet, from admiral to able-bodied seaman, felt an immense surge of relief. After nearly 4 years, U.S. had won the victory. On August 30th, American troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on Japanese soil at Yokosuka Naval Base, south of Tokyo. U.S. officers quickly assumed control of the installation and issued orders on procedure to the Japanese officers who had been in charge. With U.S. command firmly established, the Stars and Stripes was raised over the Japanese homeland. Later that same day, a silver C-54 bearing an important passenger came into Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. The commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur had completed the last leg of the long drive to the Japanese homeland. The general was greeted by one of his most faithful field officers, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, 8th Army Commander. General MacArthur was ready and eager to take over control of the conquered country. On the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a Japanese delegation arrived early on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, to make the unconditional surrender official. The Japanese contingent faced an impressive array of Allied officers. The ceremonies were directed by the new Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Japan, General MacArthur, who took a firm attitude toward the conquered people.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Representing the Emperor at the proceedings which concluded the costliest war in world history was Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who formally surrendered for his country, thus committing Japan to accept the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. A few hundred U.S. servicemen witnessed the climax of 4 years of war in the Pacific. That war ended officially at 8 minutes past 9 a.m. on September 2nd, 1945.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The formal surrender of the Japanese nation on the deck of the Missouri was followed by other dramatic surrender ceremonies. On Rota Island in the Marianas, one of the many groups of Japanese troops on bypassed islands gave themselves up to the victorious Americans. Great quantities of Japanese weapons and equipment were taken over by the GIs, and the enemy soldiers taken into custody, preparatory to being returned to Japan. The last man off Wake Island, Colonel Walter Baylor, was the first man back. The Japanese garrison surrendered the island to U.S. forces on September 4th, 45, 3 years and 8 months after other Japanese troops had seized the island, in a battle which will live long in the memory of all Americans. In Malaya and throughout the Southeast Asia Command, British Commonwealth forces accepted the surrender of the Japanese troops. Although they conformed to the surrender protocol, many of the Japanese in this theater did not feel they had been defeated. Singapore was the setting for the principal ritual in Lord Mountbatten's command. The Union Jack flew proudly over this British colonial city, which had been beaten into submission in early 1942. In the Philippines, General Jonathan Wainwright arrived after a quick flight from Japan to accept the surrender of the Japanese forces in those islands. Forces commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The ceremony at the Philippine summer capital at Baguio in northern Luzon took just 11 minutes. The once feared Tiger of Malaya surrendered the remnants of his army in the Philippines. This was a long-awaited moment for General Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines 40 months earlier, and for Britain's General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. Immediately following the brief ceremony, the Japanese commander and his party were taken away as prisoners of war. Japan wore the face of a conquered nation. The country's traditional way of life, which had prevailed for centuries, was altered overnight. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur became the new ruler of a people who were accustomed to swearing allegiance to one person, whom they considered supreme. The general was well suited to his role, supreme commander of an occupation charged with exacting complete obedience from 80 million subjects of a nation which had until recently been a fanatical enemy. Technically, the Supreme Commander was to be advised by a council of representatives of the four allied powers which had waged war against Japan. But actually, this body was impotent from the start. The delegates were constantly at odds, and any recommendations they made were given scant attention. The deposed ruler of the Japanese people, Emperor Hirohito, and the Empress Nagako were stripped of their divinity by the occupation. But it was decided not to try the emperor as a war criminal. With the royal authority curtailed, the emperor had more time for his study of marine biology. The sparing of the emperor, still revered by his people, proved a good political move by the occupation. But Japan's top war leaders received far different treatment. The men charged with the responsibility for guiding Japan onto the road of aggression were taken in hand promptly by the occupation. The number one war criminal was General Hideki Tojo, wartime premier. On November 12, 1948, after hearings which lasted 2.5 years, the International Military Tribunal convened to pass sentence on some of the top Japanese war leaders. Premier Tojo was charged with the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of aggressive war, and with violations of the laws and customs of war, and crimes against humanity. But by assuming full responsibility for the war, as charged, Tojo reestablished his reputation for loyalty and courage. Finally, after the great mass of evidence had been sifted, the court pronounced sentence on the accused.
Accused Tojo Hideki, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
The occupation's job of controlling 80 million people who had until recently hated America and Americans went smoothly. The once despised GIs were assisted by Japanese police who had been judged trustworthy. The Japanese people seemed to reconcile themselves quickly to the fact that the war was over and they had lost. The country's most immediate post-war problem was one of sustaining life, a problem Japan had in common with a number of other Asiatic lands. Nippon's 80 million people simply could not produce enough food to keep themselves alive. In the years following the end of the war, the Japanese were able to supply only about 3/4 of the food necessary for the population of the home islands, existing on a meager diet. One possible source of food expansion lay in the removal of restrictions on the permitted fishing area. The yield from the seas could conceivably be boosted above pre-war levels. Agriculturally, the situation was less flexible. The occupation had initiated a program of land reforms, which seemed a hopeful experiment. But the basic problem remained: not enough arable land. And the farmer's small income was drained by increased food and tax collections. Most Japanese, like Hiroshi Akabane, took a philosophical view of the situation.
We Japanese have always been frugal people. But after the end of the war, Many of our men, women, and children went hungry. Many starved during the first half year. Considering that we are a conquered nation, most of our people felt they were lucky to be still alive. Of course, our people all hope to live better at some future time. And now that the war is over and out of the people's minds and hearts, we can work toward making our lives better than it is today on our island, which we once called Mizuho no Kuni, land of plentiful rice. The American soldiers became very popular in Japan. Most of my people found them friendly and kind. There was no unhappiness in our association with them. Japan was greatly helped by their presence. The important officers of the occupation were very kind to our Japanese diplomats and businessmen, who were given much advice by those officers. With their help, Japan struggled to build a new democratic nation.
The Japanese Diet convened on September 4, 1945, for the first time since the surrender. The Diet voted in favor of bills calling for an end to many long-standing Japanese laws and customs, always following directives from the U.S. Supreme Commander's office. The new Japan's leading political figure, Premier Shigeru Yoshida, had opposed the militarist clique and was thus in high favor with the occupation. While the operation of the Japanese Diet and Cabinet gave all appearances of actively guiding the country, in actual fact, they were simply rubber stamps endorsing policies originating with the occupation. Japan's political leaders were dependent completely on occupation approval. The course of Japan's political progress was not entirely smooth. A small but active communist group operated openly. The Japanese communists were more interested in their own objectives in Japan than in relations with Moscow. Some party leaders, like Sanzo Nosaka, were denounced by Russia. The Japanese communist paper, Akahata, was eventually suspended by occupation authorities. But the party itself was never formally outlawed. It was felt that it was far wiser to permit its members to demonstrate openly than to give their movement impetus by driving it underground. But in time, the activities of the party were rigidly checked. None of the party leaders was permitted to hold political office. The communist movement in Japan never became a matter of grave concern. Beginning in 1946, with the return from the USSR of Japanese prisoners of war, the ranks of Japan's communists swelled temporarily. These men had been forcibly indoctrinated during their stay in Russian territory. But any enthusiasm for communism the soldiers may have had usually evaporated quickly in the stimulating climate of the new Japan. One of the first jobs the occupation concentrated on was instructing the Japanese in the ways of democracy. This introduction to an entirely new concept of acceptable conduct was received with interest by the Japanese. Japanese women walked alongside their husbands rather than a few paces behind. Romance blossomed spontaneously. Japanese girl often met Japanese boy informally, without any prearranged plan on the part of the parent. In the new Japan, women led active lives outside their homes, in addition to caring for their families. In the best American tradition, Japanese politicians campaigned for election. Although the privilege of helping select a candidate for office was still not fully appreciated by many Japanese people, they seemed to enjoy the procedure. In the new Japan, women were given the vote. Beginning in 1946, thousands of women who suddenly had political and legal rights by order of the government went to the polls. Some of the new voters cast their ballots for the same candidates their husbands backed. Some others voted exclusively for women candidates. In the first general election, women won 39 seats in the Diet. Anything American, even the square dance, was seized on with great determination by Japanese of all ages. In their effort to become really democratic, the Japanese solemnly aped all the outward manifestations of American life. Concluding that coeducational schools were part of the democratic system, the Japanese made many schools coeducational. Schools for students of one sex were quickly transformed to accommodate both. From the very beginning of the occupation, the GIs themselves were the best advertisement for democracy. Overnight, the American soldiers changed in the eyes of the Japanese people. No longer were they the despised enemy. In this lightning transformation, they became the heroes of the new Japan.
Japanese children grew especially fond of American soldiers. In Tokyo and other large cities, there are reminders of America everywhere you look. American motion pictures again became popular with the people all over Japan.
There is no doubt that the Japanese were genuinely fascinated with the trappings of American civilization. But this enthusiasm for things American in no way replaced the people's devotion to their traditional culture. Japan's age-old culture still exerted a powerful attraction. Whether democracy could be successfully superimposed over such a strong national tradition in a few short years was questionable. But certainly the impression made by the American GIs on the Japanese people will be a lasting one. For centuries, most Japanese have been ardent Buddhists. And today, the majority of the population is Buddhist. In addition, many Japanese participate in Shinto, the worship of innumerable gods, modern as well as ancient. Before and during the war, the leaders of the government diverted this worship to their own purposes, the furthering of the war effort and the building up of the militarists and their program. In post-war Japan, Shinto is as strong as ever, but minus the elements of state Shintoism. In Kyoto, as in most large Japanese cities, Shinto festivals are held at various times of the year in honor of specific gods. This Gyun festival in Kyoto, Japanese cultural center, honored a god of prehistoric times. The occupation was particularly concerned with getting Japanese industry back on its feet. Labor unions were formed with the approval of the occupation. But when they showed signs of becoming too strong, their powers, such as the right to strike, were severely curtailed. But the life of the worker in post-war Japan is improving as Japan moves toward its economic recovery. In the first years of the occupation, monopolies were made illegal. But gradually the influence of the Zaibatsu, the pre-war industrial magnates, again became strong. In the new Japan, there was a decidedly conservative cast to the leadership of Japanese industry, matching the situation in Japanese political life. Considering the circumstances which existed at the end of the war, the accomplishments of the occupation in helping effect Japan's recovery have been notable. Most Americans in Japan find it hard to be sure what the Japanese people really think about democracy and the democratic institutions and habits they have acquired. It is still too early to determine whether democracy will really take root in Japan. Whatever the occupation's achievements prove ultimately to be, the U.S. has successfully transformed an enemy nation into an ally and gained the most important bastion against communism in the Far East. The urgent need for a military foothold in the Orient grows more apparent with each passing month. All over Eastern and Southern Asia, the end of World War II was followed by eruptions of nationalism, eruptions which the Soviet Union in some areas turned to its own purposes.